Who are we talking about today, Ethan?
We were talking about King Frederick William III of Prussia. He's the Prussian king during the Napoleonic Wars.
And you and I were talking before we came on. The thumbnail sketch is, he inherits the great Frederick the Great's empire. Prussia loses, Jena, Auerstedt. He's sidelined at Tilsit, and then we never really hear from him again. Is that kind of the thumbnail sketch of him?
Yeah, that's basically how people present him. And he's sort of presented as weak and indecisive and melancholic. And he was just sort of there.
There's more to this guy, isn't there?
There is. And that's sort of what my dissertation argues.
Okay, so let's dive into it. He was born in August 1770 in Potsdam, son of King Frederick William II and Queen Frederica Louise. What was his upbringing like?
So his upbringing would have been fairly similar to most royalty. The interesting thing about him is, and this sometimes happens with royalty, but his upbringing was overseen by Frederick the Great than by his father. His father doesn't become king until he's, if I'm doing my math right, 16. So it's really Frederick the Great who sort of oversees how he wants his education to go forward. And Frederick the Great has him brought up largely in the Enlightenment tradition. He had a man by the name of, former diplomat, if I recall, by the name of Christian Friedrich Gotthard Banisch, oversee his education. And he basically tells him to do you're going to give him orders, you're going to give things, but you're going to explain the reasons why you're doing all these things. You're going to make him understand that there's reasons for everything we're doing. And he raises him in that tradition until really he gets handed over to the other major Prussian military tradition, which is he joins the army, and his education is overseen by a procession of army officers who teach him the basics of military life, the basics of history, politics, languages, those types of things. Frederick the Great made sure to stress that he didn't want him to become arrogant or overbearing, or sort of the idea of the spoiled prince. He wanted to avoid that. And some people feel that he may have gone too far in ensuring that he didn't become too arrogant or too sort of full of himself. It's also worth noting that the last years of Frederick the Great are really tense ones in Prussia, because Frederick the Great was always kind of grumpy and sarcastic, and it gets worse and worse in his last years. But he sort of allows a lot of some of the institutions of Prussia to sort of degenerate. And there's this kind of a feeling of fear and tension in the court, usually in Potsdam, but sometimes Berlin. And so that's sort of what his upbringing is like until he's 16.
So he's Frederick the Great's grandnephew, correct?
Yes. His father is the nephew of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great has no children. He's married, but Frederick the Great was probably gay, so he had very little to do with his wife, shut her out more or less completely. And so he selects basically his oldest nephew, who is Frederick William II, to be his successor. So his father was next in line to the throne.
Okay. So the future King Frederick William III, he's known as shy, reserved, and conscientious to a fault, in contrast to his father's more indulgent personality. Do you think he shared any similarities with his predecessors, notably Frederick the Great?
Not a ton. I'd say the thing that he has with Frederick the Great is that he's stubborn. Some of the things he does are explained by stubbornness rather than indecision in some ways, and we can get into that later on. He is shy. He has I've heard it described as sort of a more, I don't know if this is exactly right, but it's close, sort of a more middle class ethos, more middle class sort of personality. He's quiet. Once he becomes married, he is deeply in love with his wife and deeply dedicated to his family, but he's very private about it. He's not that outgoing. He's not gregarious. He's not really that into court ceremony. Contrasts very much with his friend Alexander of Russia, who very much is all of these things.
Yeah. And it's hard to follow a legend, like in any situation, whether you're an athlete or a movie star. If your parents or uncle was this world famous leader, it's hard to follow in those footsteps.
It is, and it's one of the weird things about, honestly, all political systems have this. They just run into this in different ways, right? But you don't get geniuses all the time, right? Like, not everyone's a genius. Not everyone can be Frederick the Great. Frederick William III is a guy, right? Like, he's an ordinary person. He's not an idiot. He is an ordinary person, and he's aware of that. And it takes him a while sort of to develop his confidence, develop his ruling style, sort of figure out where his place in all this is.
He receives, like you mentioned, normal military training of a prince in Prussia and works his way up from lieutenant and eventually becomes a colonel. And then he becomes king of Prussia at age 27 in 1797, following his father's death. Do you think he was ready to become king?
That's actually a very interesting question. Probably not, but I don't know that he was ever going to be until he did it.
It's a flawed question because who's ever ready to be king?
Yeah, but like worse for him in many ways, he does not like his father. He does not get along with his father. He does not approve of his father. And his father isn't really that interested in him. So he does get some experience of statecraft and warfare during the War of the First Coalition. He leads some troops during the war, but his father makes sure he doesn't put in too much danger, right? Make sure that, and so does the Duke of Brunswick, who's commanding Prussian forces. And he's there for some of the political stuff before the war, but he's not really brought in to his father's close counsels. He's not closely relied on. And this is actually fairly common. So it's a sort of a side thing. The Prussian rulers honestly have this idea of fathers and sons being very different. If you look at the succession through their lines, they're very different. They often don't get along. But in some ways, this was even worse because while Frederick the Great didn't get along with his father in his later years did bring him into some of his councils. And Frederick did finally come to some sort of, I wouldn't say friendship or understanding, but like basically bent the knee and did what he needed to do to meet his father's expectations. That never really happens with Frederick William III. And so his experience of war and his experience of statecraft is kind of observing but not really participating. The other thing he takes out of the War of the First Coalition, so for those, the Prussians are involved in the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars from 1792 to 1795 when they decide this isn't serving us anymore and call it quits. He feels as if his father had kept him out of battle. This isn't entirely true, right? He's a young man in his first war, but he feels as if his father had made sure he missed the major battles. And he definitely feels as if he is not confident in his military abilities, especially as a commander, that his father kept him out of action and he didn't get the experience he needed and that he didn't feel he was ready in a military sense. That is definitely true.
Yeah, and we'll see that come up later when he's facing the genius of Napoleon. Let's talk about Queen Louise, who he marries not long after, a beloved and influential consort admired throughout Prussia. Napoleon once called her, quote, the only real man in Prussia. What was their marriage like? I know they had many children.
Yeah, so their marriage was very happy, which is not necessarily a common or a given with royalty because it's arranged marriage, but he fell deeply in love with her. She apparently also fell deeply in love with him. They were very close. She was his primary emotional support. Seems to have been his main source through the early years of his life of companionship and sort of intimacy. He didn't really have a lot of friends, didn't really have the same circle. Like he had advisors he relied on and trusted in political matters, but they weren't his friends. When I'm looking through, I was just, when you asked me this question, I was trying to sit through and like, can I think of any of his any friends he had off the top of my head?
I mean, Napoleon didn't have a lot of true friends either.
Yeah, and so you don't get that a lot as a ruler necessarily, but Frederick William definitely relied on his wife for this. And so their relationship is very close. They are very devoted to each other. They're very private, though. We just know less about them. A lot of the stuff is they didn't write as much. We have some of the letters that Louise sent to her friends where she was basically saying he's a good man and I'm happy with him, but they don't go much more into their private life beyond that. And he is devastated later on when she dies.
Yeah, and they have, was it 9 kids, 10 kids, something like that?
Yeah, they have a lot of children. 2 of them go on to become future kings of Prussia. And so the relationship isn't perfect. He's frustrated because in her later years, earlier on, she sort of isn't as involved in politics during the first few years of their marriage. Later on, probably starting around 1803, 1804, she starts to become more involved in politics. And she's definitely more aligned with, in Prussia, there's the pro-French, or it's less pro-French, but sort of the neutrality / pro-French party that thinks Prussia should just stay out of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Prussia doesn't have anything involved in this. And then there's the anti-French war party, who sees the French as the threat, who sees Napoleon as sort of this overwhelming ambition that's going to become a problem needs to be dealt with. She definitely aligns herself with them.
Yeah.
So the king feels like they're trying to influence her to get to him through her, and he's frustrated with this, and he feels that she will take on the opinions of people who talk to her and take them as her own. That might not be fair because she seemed to, throughout her entire life, be fairly steadily opposed to Napoleon, to believe Prussia should fight Napoleon, should align itself with with the coalition powers, and constantly supported and helped politicians who would. For example, when Stein, during I think it was 1805, may have been early 1806, was sending a petition to Frederick William to try to encourage the war party. She edits his petition, and at one point she just stops it getting to him. She's like, "This will be. I know my husband's will be actively counterproductive." So she's trying to help push his policy and try to help him put his best foot forward and make the best impression.
Right. Let's talk about his kind of domestic reforms. He tries to restore moral discipline and reduce court extravagance, promoting personal virtue and some frugality. How are these reforms received in Prussia? Because it sounds to me like Tsar Alexander and his father, Tsar Paul, they had a lot of conflicts on how things should be run. It sounds like a lot of similarities there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Alexander maybe had his father killed. So
yeah, right. Maybe more extreme in that case. Yeah.
But yeah, so there is some of this. This is sort of reform in Prussia before 1806 is very strange because some of it is personal. He definitely changes the tenor of the court. It's less, his father has lots of mistresses, has affairs, is extravagant, also a bit of a mystic, kind of into some of the Protestant mysticism at the time, which Frederick William isn't. So he's going to move away from that. He fires a number of his father's advisors. He prosecutes his father's favorite and mistress, Countess Lichtenau. And so part of that, there's that. And it's sort of a more personal, the king is changing his personal ways. He's less extravagant. He doesn't have mistresses and is faithful to his wife. So there's a certain amount of that. But that all is sort of on a personal level. And he does try to change some things in Prussia more societally. And there's also going to be some in Prussia who are trying to reform the Prussian army and state, which are linked, but not necessarily the same. They all kind of run into similar problems. So he considers trying to, for instance, Frederick Wilhelm III considers trying to end serfdom or moving towards ending serfdom. And he runs into the problem of, it's sort of this thing, because there are a lot of Enlightenment thought in Prussia and a lot of things, and everyone's in favor of this in theory.
Sure.
And like everyone's in favor in theory of increasing the revenue of the crown and getting the monarchy on a firmer foot, on a better financial footing, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't want to pay taxes. The nobility doesn't want to pay taxes.
Great idea, but I don't want to pay anything. Yeah.
It's the problem that always comes up with this. It's like kind of what started the French Revolution, right? It's like, oh yes, we should play the problem, as long as someone else pays for it, right? And so it kind of goes nowhere. And this is something where we maybe do see a level of lack of confidence, though that's a little unfair because he's not the only one who gives up on this. A lot of people, most of the people approach this sort of see the resistance they're going to face and go, not worth it, right? This is going to be a big fight. We're not going to have it. The nobility is going to put up a fight if you tax them, not going to have it. With the army, it's like, okay, they're able to get some minor reforms, but like the old guard is putting up serious resistance, so they can only go so far. And there's a level of complacency in Prussia that they're riding high off Frederick the Great. They came out of the 7 Years' War as the big victors, or at least that's how they feel about it. And they don't do badly during the wars of the First Coalition. This is a thing to remember, that like the Prussians aren't involved in a lot of battles.
Right.
But they do fine in the ones they're in. They think they won. They won these mid to small size battles and then just retreat. So they think their systems work.
Yeah, like Valmy, they pretty much marched through France until Valmy, and then they turned around and went home.
And it's not like they're routed or beaten at Valmy. They decide, yeah, this isn't going to work. And there's like 2 or 3 other battles where like they win tactical victories in 1793, Pirmasens and Kaiserslautern.
Yeah,
and then retreat because of other stuff around them.
Well, that kind of leads me into 1805, and before we get to the end of Auerstedt, the Austrians and the Russians are like pleading with Frederick, like, look, we need your help, get involved here. And kind of mentioned before, you said he would just stubbornly said, no, I don't want to be involved in the Third Coalition.
Yeah, the thing I think Frederick William, one of the things he takes out of the War of the First Coalition is he's like, what did Prussia get out of this? I didn't get anything out of this. Why were we here? I don't know why we're here. It was an opportunity. The reason they were there is his father thought he might be able to, quickly cash in on a week in France. And then when he realizes that's not happening, he drops out, right? And to give Frederick William his credit, there's this idea in later German history writing that, especially after Prussia unites Germany, that Prussia had this mission to unite Germany. That was always in Prussia's interest to unite Germany, and that it always should have been moving that way. But that's sort of reading history backwards. From the Prussians' point of view at the time, they don't actually have a lot of stake in the Napoleonic Wars up to that point. So even in 1800, when the Second Coalition's forming, Frederick William stays out of it. His thought is like, why would I get involved in this? This is about stuff I don't care about. Prussia has nothing to gain in this. Why would we? And he's sort of in the same point in 1805. And he personally dislikes war, right? He doesn't like war. He doesn't want to go to war.
And I think you make a great point there. Like King Frederick William never probably had a grand scheme of uniting all of Germany until, maybe Napoleon even had more to do with it than him. Napoleon gets rid of the Holy Roman Empire and all these little tiny states and just makes larger states. And then maybe after 1813, maybe he's like, all right, maybe we can unite all of Germany at some point.
But even then, that's more of a liberal sort of dream of the reformists, liberal faction. Frederick William III never really bought into that. He's a Prussian, and he's not really a German nationalist. And so his view was, well, what do I have to gain about this? Now, what ends up drawing them in and what gets them involved is Hanover, which is, getting into the complexities, it is a German princedom ruled by the King of Britain. But the British maintain it's not part of Britain. Our king just happens to rule it. So it's complicated, politics. The Prussians won it because it would unite all the Prussia's territory. Prussia is a weird state that its territory is not contiguous. It has holdings on the in West Germany, holdings in Central and East Germany. Hanover would give them that. And so they end up occupying Hanover at multiple points. The French occupy Hanover at different points. And the Prussians sort of, can we maybe finagle a way to get Hanover in Prussian possession? That's the sort of hook that draws them into this. And it's the reason they go back and forth, because the French actually offer them Hanover, but Frederick Wilhelm wants to get Hanover without making an enemy of the British. And that's just fundamentally not going to happen. But that's sort of what brings them in 1805. And eventually they decide, well, what triggers the Prussians to eventually decide, okay, we're going to intervene in 1805 is the French march across Prussian territory.
Correct.
Going to Ulm.
Yeah.
But the Prussians do this thing where they try to slow play it. And this is actually less indecision and more the Prussian foreign minister, Hardenberg, is trying to drive a really hard bargain. So he slow plays Prussian intervention to try to get the best deal he can out of the Russians, Austrians, and British. The problem is he slow plays it just long enough for Austerlitz to happen.
Right.
And then the Prussians are sitting here going, well, wait, we signed this treaty. We gave this ultimatum. We were going to give this ultimatum to Napoleon. And now we're sitting here and he's destroyed the Austrians. The Russians are in full retreat. And we just have to take whatever offer he gives us.
Yeah. Yeah. And they kind of go into it alone now. Well, not alone, but without Austria. They faced Napoleon's armies during the disastrous War of the Fourth Coalition, resulting in Prussia's crushing defeat at Jena and Auerstedt. What happened here? Why was this war so lopsided in the favor of the French, probably to the surprise of everyone in Europe except Napoleon?
Yeah, so many reasons, right? This one is one where everything goes wrong for the Prussians, because the War of the Third Coalition ends and they were going to join, but then they don't. And they spend like 6 months going back and forth about, are we going to take this French deal? Are we not? And then they go to war with the French. And it's very strange. So the war is declared in October, but Frederick Wilhelm knows he's going to war in August. He doesn't actually know if he's going to get Russian help. And the Prussians plan for war as if they're not going to. The Russians will join them, but Russia's a long way from Prussia. Russian armies aren't there. And the Prussian army it's not fully reformed up to the French changes in tactics, but there had been some reforms. They adopted a little bit of light infantry. They adopted a new general staff system. They still didn't really know how to use it, so it doesn't perform well. They tried to adopt divisions. These are all adopted in 1806, and they don't really know how to use them. And it's clear they don't know how to use them. So they're reforming their army as they're going. But the real problem they have is in command. Frederick Wilhelm doesn't take command himself. The first plan they made, I think it was written up by the Duke of Brunswick and Scharnhorst, and I think there was one or two other officers. But they write up this plan that assumes that Frederick Wilhelm's going to take personal command of the army. He doesn't. But he also goes with the army. And he's doing this thing that he did with the civilian government, where where he'll keep multiple, for the civilian government, he might keep multiple foreign ministers around or multiple foreign advisors. And if one supports a policy he doesn't like, he'll move to another to sort of ensure that he's got the policy he wants. And it seems like he's sort of doing this in the military sphere, but this doesn't work there, right? Like it leads to uncertainty of command because the king has these old favorites around him who are giving him advice. He's technically appointed the Duke of Brunswick to be his overall commander, but he's not really made it clear that. Scharnhorst writes in this one letter, he's like, I reported to head the royal headquarters, or maybe the Duke of Brunswick's headquarters. Like, Scharnhorst, even in his letter at the time, is like, whose headquarters is this really? And that's one of the major problems that the Prussians have. This leads to them being slow making their plan. The Prussians know they're going into war in August. They don't start planning until the end of August. They have 2 weeks where they know they're going to war. They don't start making a plan. They don't start mobilizing. They don't finalize a plan until September 27th. But they still haven't mobilized, right? So they still have to get their army concentrated to actually enact their plan. The Prussians don't start to move until October 7th. So the one advantage they have, they're fighting without the support of the Russians. Russians won't be there for a year. The one advantage they might have is they could hit Napoleon before he even knows war started. And they waste that because, like, by contrast, you can see it with Napoleon. Napoleon doesn't really expect war until the beginning of September, but this sort of shows you this difference, right? He makes his first call up on September 5th. He doesn't know for sure he's going to war yet, but he's already planning, and he already has the idea of a plan. So that when he knows he's going to war, he settled on a plan by September 17th, and he's executing it before the Prussians do.
Yeah, and I've read that the rigidity of the Prussian system, the 7 Years' War, and how strict the discipline was, and they still encourage corporal punishment, and they just follow their orders. Where Napoleon's system was more fluid, divisional commanders, battalion commanders were allowed some flexibility to change plans on their own and have initiative that the Prussians didn't.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. That Napoleon, when you read his correspondence, he's writing letters and giving orders to either Berthier, and Berthier is distributing them, or to his marshals, who are usually commanding corps. And when you look at Brunswick and Frederick William during this, especially Brunswick, he's giving orders to battalion commanders. And so it just makes it far harder for them to get anything moving. They don't have the larger, like they do have, if you look at the, Scharnhorst has one of his letters that has the order of battle, in which he sort of gives the order of battle. And he's dividing it up by divisions, but they're not used to operating that way. And so they're not really sending orders to divisional commanders and letting them figure it out. And so instead they have to send so many more orders and get so many more people involved, and it's just so slow.
Yeah, that delay, which gives Napoleon's armies the advantage, because there's one guy making a decision, and it's disseminating very quickly through Berthier and the marshals. And as you said, just the motion of the army is just going faster.
There's this debate about what plan the Prussians should have gone for in 1806. So they basically had two viable options. One was Brunswick's plan was to march south, hit the French armies while they're still in their cantonments in southern Germany, catch them, win a battle, then go into winter quarters. Now, this means Brunswick clearly doesn't expect Napoleon to make a major campaign before the end of the year, and it's just sort of trying to get a victory going. That's not a terrible plan if they execute it fast. But they execute it so slowly that by the time they're moving, the French aren't vulnerable in their cantonments. They're concentrated under Napoleon's command. The other plan, which is painful because it probably does involve giving up a lot of Prussian territory, is Scharnhorst wants to fall back and link up with the Russians. Scharnhorst doesn't want to try to fight Napoleon. Scharnhorst does think Napoleon's going to come for them this year, and he wants to link up with the Russians before trying to fight. But this might mean abandoning Berlin, right? This means abandoning a lot of Prussian territory to Napoleon. They decide on Brunswick's plan, but by the time they execute it, it's too late. The opportunity's gone.
Yeah, they have to retreat out of Berlin. A lot of Prussian fortresses get captured, but they stay in the war with the Russians until Friedland's disaster, where Napoleon destroys the Russian army there. And you have the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807, and Prussia's forced to cede nearly half of their kingdom and submit to French dominance. And there's this great scene at Tilsit where King Frederick William is famously left on the shore while Napoleon and Tsar Alexander negotiate peace. How humiliating was this for the king and for Prussia?
Oh, very. That's also an intentional. Napoleon's doing this on purpose. Napoleon knows what he's doing. He's intentionally humiliating the Prussians. Napoleon's angry with the Prussians. Napoleon thinks the Prussians have backed out on deals and tried to double deal with him multiple times. And he is kind of contemptuous of Frederick Wilhelm. He goes out of his way to make it clear that he doesn't think much of Frederick Wilhelm. And there's also the thing, it's not just that he's sitting on the shore. He's not sure if he's going to keep his kingdom.
Yeah.
Napoleon Napoleon makes it clear that he's treating Alexander as an equal, and he has this whole almost bromance thing with Alexander at the time. Alexander must have been a very charming individual because like everyone who meets him seems to like have this intense period where when they're with him, they seem to really like him, or some really hate him, but a lot really like him, right? And so Napoleon and Alexander are negotiating and get this good rapport, and he's part of this is Frederick William realizes Napoleon's kind of cutting him out of a lot of these decisions. He's cutting the Prussians out of a lot of these negotiations. He's making sure not to bring up business until later in the night when Frederick William's gone. Frederick William has to rely on Alexander to advocate for him. According to Alexander, Alexander had to stop Napoleon from dismembering the Prussian state entirely. And so Frederick William very much feels this humiliation. And Napoleon like goes out of his way to make sure he feels it and to try to cut him out. Even when the one time when later on when he does sort of try to press Napoleon for a better deal, Napoleon just sort of shuts him down. And he's in a position where like, well, what leverage does he have? His armies were completely destroyed. For the second half of the war, it's the Russians who are mostly doing almost all the fighting. There's the interesting thing of Napoleon offered him a peace deal after Jena Auerstedt, which he Frederick William rejects, gambling that the Russians are going to win, and the Russians don't. And so ends up resulting in a really harsh peace for the Prussians.
Yeah, and I could see Napoleon's point on that. You know, you didn't help me against Austria, then you went to war with me the year after. Then the year after that, you sided with the Russians, you even helped them at Eylau, and here we are. So yeah, I think he is kind of lucky that Napoleon let him keep his throne.
In some ways, you could argue that was probably a mistake on Napoleon's part. You could maybe argue Napoleon should have dismembered Prussia, but that gets into a lot of like Napoleon's grand plans. But yeah, in the treaty takes half of Prussian territory. Going to follow up negotiations in Paris the next year that limit the Prussian army to 42,000 men. For some context, like on their rolls, when you count in garrison forces and everything, it was 254,000 before the war. So really slicing the Prussian army down.
Yeah. And obviously, you know, all the Prussians see the need for reforms and recovery. Key ministers like Stein, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Blücher are among those modernizing the army through education and administration. How important were these men and the king in Prussia's recovery?
So those men are very important. And this is where sort of the idea of like how people perceive this period, they usually get all of the credit for sort of Prussia's recovery. Scharnhorst is so the military reforms Scharnhorst is involved in. He has other people helping him. Gneisenau is helping him. York helps him with some infantry, like writing some of these infantry manuals. He's basically reforming the army more or less from the ground up. Hermann von Boyen's another guy who helps him out. But there's also an attempt to reform the Prussian state because there's this feeling that there was sort of the structure of the Prussian state where there's no real firm cabinet authorities and the king just appoints people to do what he wants and there's multiple lines of authority. There was a feeling that had led to a lot of the poor decision making and the poor performance before and during the Jena campaign. And so guys like Stein at first is appointed, I think he appoints him foreign minister, but he's essentially prime minister if they don't have that title yet or chancellor yet. But that's essentially what Stein is. And he starts to try to reform the state from the ground up. He's going to force through some of these reforms that hadn't gone through before. They're going to force through an edict to end serfdom. They're going to reform the education system. Stein actually isn't in power very long. He gets on the wrong side of Napoleon. He gets ties to this secret group that wants to unite Germany against Napoleon. Napoleon hears about it and basically tells Frederick William, fire him or else. And so like, well, I got to fire him. And so he spends a few years trying to figure some things out, and then eventually calls Hardenberg back. And Hardenberg carries out some financial reforms to get the Prussian state on order. They reform the Prussian executive to make it these established ministers that the king appoints, but the ministers are responsible for their area of expertise, and they go through it. Like there was in 1806, two Prussian foreign ministers conducting two different foreign policies that neither of them knew what the other was doing. There are reforms along those lines. The reforms of the army are in some ways just as or more important. The Prussians, more so than anyone else, basically do adopt the full Napoleonic. They move to adapt training all their men to skirmish, adopting assault columns as their primary tactical approach. They adapt combined arms divisions and really commit to them. They sort of reform. They sort of work out the kinks with the general staff and sort of clarify what their new general staff is doing, what their roles are going to be, sort of reform the army at every level, and more so than any of the other opponents of France really did. All of them would institute some of these reforms, but none of them really went all the way like the Prussians did.
Yeah, and while all this is going on, King Frederick William suffers another blow. Queen Louise dies in 1810, deeply affecting the king. How did she pass away?
So best I've been able to find is it's heart failure from pneumonia, but she'd been sick for a lot of the year. She'd been having poor health for a while, and so she finally succumbs in 1810 to heart failure. And this massively affects the king. He does sort of step back a little bit from sort of government business. And it's always weird because he was never he's not like Frederick the Great. He was never his own foreign minister. He was never the most hands-on, but he still was overseeing everything. He steps back a little bit for a while, and it does very deeply affect him, partly because he doesn't really have anyone else to rely on or to take her place.
Yeah, it's sad. I know he gets married later again in life, but not till like 1824.
He does, and there's this whole thing of like, he had a series of, starting in 1815, he has this series of when he's at Vienna or the peace conferences in France. It's a series of like, I don't know if there was ever any physical, but like emotional sort of attachments, affairs, whatever you want to. I don't think they ever got to that level, but like people he was maybe interested in marrying, but there was always a reason he wasn't supposed to. And the wife he ends up marrying, it's a left-handed marriage because she's so far below him in social station. And like borderline, he's keeping it secret for a while because a number of people don't approve of it. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear that he was looking for someone to replace Louise because that left like a hole in his life that didn't really have any other way to fill.
Yeah. You know, he for a while has to ally himself with Napoleon. He sends troops in the 1812 invasion of Russia under Napoleon. But after Napoleon's defeat in Russia, he declares war 1813 on Napoleon. How was Prussia able to rebuild its army and fight toe-to-toe with the French? I know we talked about it a little bit. You know, they kind of restyled their system almost on the French system with corps and as you were talking, easier lines of communication. But did they rebuild their army in secret under Napoleon's nose?
They tried, but that's not really what worked. So they could reform their army, and they did reform their army. Their biggest issue they had was manpower. The one thing they have going for them is all of the French reforms had been proposed and debated before 1806. And so by the time they get to 1806, basically what happens is the reformists all get into power. And so they're able to do the things they wanted to do before. And even Frederick William writes out this like idea in 1807 of, okay, so here's the reforms of the army that they basically end up executing over the next few years. He clearly got these ideas from reformists, and Frederick William appoints these guys and clearly backs them. And so it's very like, there's still resistance to it. It's just, no, the king's on their side now and is willing to back them. The biggest problem they have is numbers. So they're limited by treaty, and Napoleon is not stupid. He notices if they start to mobilize. They try this thing called the Krumper system, where basically their idea is we're going to bring in these guys, we're going to bring in a cadre of people, train them, and then put them as reserves and keep them off the books. And so we're basically going to hide an army. And then there was this legend that they'd sort of done that. When you look at the more scholarship, they maybe got 20 or 30,000 people that way. There weren't that many of those. Not enough. What it did do is it did give them people who could be training cadre when they start to mobilize their army. They have to rely on a Landwehr to mobilize their army. Landwehr is just German word for militia. Basically go to a form of universal conscription, or mostly universal conscription, sort of the way the French do. And they conscript these Landwehr units and sort of train them on short notice, and sort of slot them into this for the army. And so this is the problem the Prussians have. They're sort of the reverse problem they had in 1806. In 1806, they had pretty disciplined, effective professional troops on the tactical level. Now they're fighting in a slightly outdated method, but it's not that bad. Like the Frederican tactic could still be effective. The rest of their army is a problem, and they sort of have the reverse of that in 1813, where they've got a very modern doctrine, very modern organization, very modern stuff, and they have a lot of guys that they have just conscripted in, and they are not particularly well trained.
Yeah, and I think they show it well. I mean, obviously they lose at Dresden, but at Dennowitz and Konzbach, they beat Napoleon's marshals, toe to toe.
And they do pretty well. They find that they got enough people moving in the right direction. They may not be perfect soldiers, but they're good enough. And the numbers they're able to raise by August 10th, so after the armistice, they have 270,000 men under arms. which is massive compared. That's more men than they had in 1806 with half the population base.
Right.
Like
Right.
the mobilization effort is massive and is very successful. And it's sort of the reason why the armistice is such a godsend for them, because the armistice gives them time to get all these people under arms. The armistice in the middle of the 1813 campaign, all these people are now under arms, and now they're able to deploy this far larger army.
I think that's a great point. And we were talking earlier, Prussia was humiliated. So I'm sure there's plenty of volunteers who are like, yeah, sign me up.
Yeah, they were able, and like they didn't get it quite. The liberals were hoping for a more nationalist, upsurge of volunteers. They do get some of those. They do have to conscript a lot more people, but there's not serious. There's never a Vendée like conscription resistance, right? Some people are there's some grumpiness about it. There's a few small scale resistance, but for the most part, the country does come to the colors when called to them or when conscripted to them, and they do get the troops they need who are fairly well motivated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, obviously it works. Napoleon is beaten in 1814 and again at Waterloo in 1815. At the Congress of Vienna, Prussia regains and expands its territory, emerging as a leading German power. They were also very critical at Waterloo. How important was Marshal Blucher at Ligny and Waterloo?
Blucher the Prussians are very important. They've got, I'm not remembering the exact breakdowns in 1815, but roughly half the total Allied force that fights in the campaign is Prussian. Ligny is the bigger of the two battles, with that and Querbras. The Prussians lose there, but like the critical decision of the 1815 campaign is after the Prussians are defeated, they're defeated by Napoleon at Ligny, but then they retreat, and Napoleon expects them to retreat back towards the Rhine, and instead they retreat to link up with Wellington. And this is the critical part of the campaign, because at Waterloo, the Prussians show up in the mid-afternoon, and then this is what places pressure on Napoleon of, I've got another army coming, I have to win now. And he has to slowly bleed troops away from the battle against Wellington to hold off Blucher, and eventually just can't keep the battle up against both of them. His assaults to break Wellington fail, and then they overrun him with the counterattack. And the Prussians showing up there, and specifically the Prussians, and I think it's actually, if I recall, it was Gneisenau actually who makes this decision, because Blucher's under his horse after Ligny.
Correct.
When he gets shot, so his horse gets shot out from under him. So yep. Gneisenau, who's his chief of staff, makes the decision to send the Prussians to link up with the British rather than back towards the Rhine. And that is sort of the critical decision of the campaign.
Which is a huge decision, because a lot of Prussian officers said, well, they didn't help us at Ligny. Why should we go help them? But they were fighting at Quatre Bras, and they didn't know that.
No, so the Prussians were pissed. The Prussians felt Wellington, and I think Wellington may have actually promised to support them, and he didn't. And the Prussians are furious about this. And okay, Wellington's like, yeah, I was fighting a full-scale battle. So from Wellington would argue, yes, but I was fighting the French and didn't have the ability to get there. But the Prussians hold a grudge on this one. And they felt like they were betrayed, but they put that aside and stick with the alliance. And this is the thing, I think, the other factor that I think in 1813, Allied powers had kind of learned in 1813 of okay, we may not like each other. We may not get along on all these things. We may have some different interests, but we're never going to win. We're stuck with each other. We have to choose a strategy and commit to it. We have to commit to the strategy. And it works. It's not brilliant, but it's good enough. And in coalition warfare, it's sort of look, there's an average plan that everyone commits to is far better than the perfect plan that no one agrees on.
Agreed. Well, let's discuss King Frederick William's later years. He spent his final decades focused on stability, religion, and moral order, less dynamic but more cautious government. And he wisely keeps Prussia out of wars during this time. So he just kind of let's just settle down and not get involved in any more wars.
That's what Frederick William had always wanted to do. He just reached a point in the Napoleonic War where he didn't have a choice but to get involved, right? And that's sort of the thing I argue, where everyone had seen him as indecisive. It's no, he knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to stay neutral. It's just that decision was taken from him. So rather than seeing him as indecisive, you should see him as a stubborn person being forced to do something he doesn't want to do. And so after the Napoleonic Wars, it's really easy for him. There aren't major wars. He can stay out of it. He can stay neutral. Europe itself quiets down for the rest of his life. And so Prussia isn't involved in imperial wars, right? It doesn't have an overseas empire. He doesn't get involved in the imperial stuff that the French and British do. And so he's just able to do what he really always wanted to do and just rule in peace.
Yeah, he dies in June 1840, succeeded by his son, Frederick William IV. What do you think his legacy is?
So his legacy is interesting because this is one of these other questions I was just thinking about. He is remembered sort of as this weak and indecisive man who was king during this period and was sort of carried through it by the people around him. That's how history remembered him. History remembered him as sort of not a bad man, but as sort of weak and indecisive, and sort of not the man with iron in his spine to deal with Napoleon. I think that's unfair. He's also been remembered as sort of this melancholic, pessimistic guy, and he was a pessimistic guy. But I think that's a little unfair in that he saw Prussia through one of its most difficult, dangerous periods of its existence, and he comes out of it better than they come into it. Prussia, you could argue Prussia isn't really a great power before the Napoleonic Wars. If it is, it's certainly the weakest of them, and they're in a far stronger position afterwards. That is clearly not all due to him. He did get help from the people around him. The reformers, his generals, they were important. He still deserves credit on the fact that he did make the decision to appoint all these people. He did support them in office. And in a few cases, especially 1809, which we didn't have time to talk about, in 1809, the reformers want to go to war with Napoleon before he's ready, and he keeps Prussia out of war and probably saves his throne. Like, if the Prussians become involved in the war, the Fifth Coalition is probably over. And it's worth noting that it's easy for the reformers to be aggressive and say that Prussia should become involved in every opportunity. It's not their throne. And Frederick Wilhelm gets Prussia through, especially after 1806, he guides Prussia through that period and keeps his throne, which he deserves credit for that.
I think that's a great point. A lot of kings in this time lost their throne. The King of Spain lost his throne. Most of the kings of the Holy Roman Empire. So if you didn't play your cards right and weren't a strong man, which I think he is, if he was a lesser man, I think he would have lost his throne. And I think he may not have played him perfectly. Obviously, 1806 is a great example. But I think he played him as well as he could in the situation he was thrust upon.
Yeah, and he sort of understood after 1806. There's some people who thought he was never going to fight the French or just submit to the French. He always did want, you can see in his letters, he was looking for an opportunity, but he understood he was probably only going to get one more chance. That if he lost again, he was going to lose his throne. So what he wanted was to wait until he could get support from both Austria and Russia.
Right.
He believed they required the support of both of them. Turns out to be right. And so his playing it, waiting and seeing, and sort of being more cautious after that does help Prussia. And I think he deserves credit for the things he gets right if you're going to blame him for the things he gets wrong.
Yeah. Really good stuff. And I learned a lot about the Prussian king. So I thank you for that, Ethan. Again, Ethan Soefje, University of North Texas graduate student. And this is fantastic. Thank you for your time, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.